Hey guys, just on the chat, if you can just let me know that if you can hear me or not. Just a quick yes. Excellent. Thank you, Aiden. All right. So today we are going to start a new booklet. So we're going to talk about circulation. So we're still in the cardiovascular module for our medical services. I'm just going to start this here. There we are. Okay. So just a couple of things for you guys to know what's up. Report card marks for me are due Monday morning, which means everything that's outstanding I'd like to have in from you guys ASAP. So there's two credits that you guys have already been awarded. So you've received your credit for first aid and you've received your credit for health foundations. Okay, so those two credits are there and that'll be on your report card. Okay, we're in the middle of the cardiovascular section, so you'll have a mark for that. A couple heads up about that. So if few of you did not write the heart quiz, please send me an email when you're ready to write it and I will reopen the quiz for you. And some of you have outstanding assignments. So right now you can't look on PowerSchool because PowerSchool has been shut down until all the marks are dealt with, but you'll be able to see that again next week. Those of you that are outstanding assignments, I will send an email to just to let you know and remind you. So I need those in as soon as possible. Okay. So that's what that is. Today you had a blood typing and blood test worksheet that was due at noon. Some of you haven't handed that in yet, so make sure you get on that, please. And then on Monday, I will post a quiz. So you'll have a quiz that's posted from Monday through Wednesday, and that's for both your blood vessels booklet and the blood booklet. Okay, so that quiz is for both of those sections. I would recommend giving it a bit of a read over and a study. I realize that it's open book, but it helps to answer the questions if you've kind of reviewed it a little bit first. It makes it way easier than trying to scramble and find stuff in your book. Okay, so that. And the unit where the section we're starting today, circulation, will not be on the quiz. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. Any questions about what's coming up? Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat, so we are going to move on. So we're going to start talking about circulation. So I'll just open that up. There we are. And we're going to go back to the very beginning here, like so. Okay, so just in the chat, can you see the PowerPoint? Just want to make sure everyone can see the PowerPoint here. Just give me a yes or a no. Anyone? I am assuming you can. All right, I'm going to go with the assumption you can. Send me a chat if you cannot see the PowerPoint. All right. So what we're talking about to start off is capillary exchange. So what we're looking at with the capillaries is how materials move in and out. So we know that capillaries are the blood vessel where material exchange occurs. Okay. So what we can look at with this capillary is you can see the flat cells that make up the walls of the capillary. So these cells are sort of flat on their side, right? And we can see the nucleus for each of those cells. But in between the cells, we see these little gaps, little spaces, and that's where fluid and different gases, etc., can come through, is these little gaps. Okay, so capillaries are a bit leaky. So if you think of my two hands as being cells, there's little gaps between my fingers. That's those gaps that allow for the fluid to go through, okay? Fluid and any other materials that are being exchanged. Okay. So we're going to talk about material exchange. So we're just going to look at it globally here, with both what's happening with our cells, our body cells, and then what's happening with the lungs. Okay. So if I look over here on the left-hand side, what I'm seeing is what's going on with our body cells. So when we have movement, there's three things that control the movement in and out of a capillary. Okay, diffusion, something blood pressure, and then something called osmotic pressure. So those three things control what moves in and out of the capillary. So our focus to start off with is diffusion. So when I think about diffusion, we're going from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration of our solute, right? So when I take a look here at our body cell, so over here I see the body cell, and then right here I see the capillary, okay? Now the capillaries at this point have lots of oxygen in them, so a high concentration of oxygen. The body cell has a low concentration of oxygen, so the oxygen is going to move from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. The body cell, because it gives off carbon dioxide as a waste product to cellular respiration, has a high concentration of of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is going to move into the capillary where there's a low concentration. Okay, so that's what's happening at our body cells. And what we see with this picture is we see the capillary network, and we see how the capillaries go from being red to blue because they're losing their oxygen. Now over here, what we're looking at is something called an alveolus. Okay, so inside our lungs, we breathe air in, and air goes through our windpipe, and then it divvies off into a couple big tubes called bronchi, and then it moves into these little tubes called bronchioles. That's what we see right here. And then into this kind of balloon sort of structure called an alveolus. So we have like millions of these alveoli. Okay, so alveoli is the plural form, alveolus is singular. So I have a whole bunch of these, and they're all surrounded by this capillary network. Okay, so this is our blood coming from our heart that's entering the capillary network, and then this is it's collecting oxygen, and there's the blood going back to our heart. Okay, so what we see happening here, here's the alveolus. So we breathe in, our alveolus is full of oxygen, so high concentration of oxygen. That high concentration of oxygen is going to move into the capillary, which has a low concentration of oxygen. Okay, because that deoxygenated blood is high in carbon dioxide because it's collected all the waste product from the cells throughout the body, that high concentration of carbon dioxide is going to cause it to diffuse to the alveoli where there's a low concentration. And then our alveoli is going to fill with carbon dioxide, and we're going to exhale, right? As it goes through the alveoli, all the tubes, and we exhale it out of our mouth, okay? So that's what's going on there. So we're going to just look at what goes on in the lung and what goes on in the body cells in a bit more detail here. Okay. All right. So again, diffusion. So this is a word that you guys have heard back in grade 8. You talked about it in grade 9. And now we're talking about it again. So diffusion, materials move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. That's what diffusion is. Okay. And it doesn't require any energy from the cell. So here's another image of what's going on inside our lungs. So we see all this tubing here, right? We see us breathing in, there's our windpipe, there's these bronchi, right? They're the big tubes, and then they branch off to all these little tubes. And then at the ends of each of these little tubes here are the alveoli. So air is coming in. Now they're coloring the air in this diagram as red because it has oxygen. And then this air is colored as blue because of the carbon dioxide. So that's just the way they decided to illustrate it. So if we look here, what's going on with the capillary around the alveoli, oxygen's coming in, it's being collected by the red blood cells, right? So they're oxygenated. The hemoglobin is attaching to the oxygen. Here in the capillary, the carbon dioxide is being lost into the alveoli so it can be exhaled. Okay, but this movement of the gases is all to do with the pressure, or all to do with the concentration of the gases. Okay. All right. So just to give you another little image here. So the alveoli, small little balloon-like structures in the lungs surrounded by this capillary network. So that's what we see in this image, is this capillary network. Okay, there's the alveoli. We can see the blood entering the capillary network, and we can see the blood leaving. So deoxygenated blood enters, oxygenated blood leaves. So what I'm going to do here is just get my pen. So what we see is we see this word pulmonary arterial, okay? So remember, arterioles are branches from arteries, so this would have to be a branch from the pulmonary artery. Okay, it's really hard to read, but that says pulmonary artery. Okay. And then the blood's going to flow into a pulmonary venule, and we want to remember venules all merge all together into veins. So this merges into the pulmonary vein. Okay. All right. I have a little review question for you. What chamber collects the blood from the pulmonary vein? Okay, just put that in your chat. What chamber collects the blood from the pulmonary vein? Come on, you guys all can't be sleeping. It's almost 1 in the afternoon. Thank you, Aiden. The left atrium collects blood from the pulmonary vein, right? That's the oxygenated blood. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that, because that's part of the big picture we learned when we talked about the heart, okay? All right, so gas exchange in the lungs. Oxygen in the alveoli diffuses into the capillaries, right? So higher concentration in the alveoli, lower concentration in the capillaries, so the oxygen is going to go to the capillaries. The blood now becomes oxygenated. Carbon dioxide from the capillaries diffuses into the alveoli, okay, because there's a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the capillary, so it's going to move into the alveoli where there's a lower concentration, and then that can be exhaled, okay? All right. So now we'll talk about what's happening in our body cells. So in our body cells, okay, so what we're looking at here is a big picture of a capillary. Okay, so this whole structure here that we're looking at, this is all a capillary. Here's the red blood cell, okay, and it's floating around in the blood plasma, which we know is mostly water, right? Here's our body cells. So our body cells don't have much oxygen, so the oxygen is going to come off of the hemoglobin on the red blood cell, and it's going to move into an area where there's less oxygen, which is the body cell. So it moves through diffusion. Carbon dioxide, because it's a waste product of cellular respiration, there's a high concentration here in the cell. It's going to diffuse over here to the plasma and the blood cell. Okay, so again, we're looking at this process of diffusion. All right, so at the body cells, oxygen in the capillary diffuses into the body cells. So now the blood in the capillary is deoxygenated because it's lost its oxygen. Carbon dioxide from the body cells diffuses into the capillaries. Okay. All right, any questions about the diffusion? All right. So that's one way that we have movement, but there's a couple other things. But before we learn that, we have to learn a couple things here. So most materials can pass through these leaky spaces in the capillaries, okay? There are some exceptions. So first of all, there's some exceptions to this leakiness. Not all capillaries are leaky. The capillaries in our brain are pretty stuck together. The capillaries in the placenta, which allows exchange between the blood of mom and the blood of developing fetus, they're pretty stuck together. They're not very leaky at all. But if we think of the rest of the capillaries, they're leaky, but they contain plasma proteins, so proteins that are in the blood plasma, and blood cells. So those get stuck inside the capillary. Now there's a few exceptions as to why they would come out of the capillary, but for the most part, they're stuck inside the capillary, okay? All right. So blood cells and plasma proteins, so proteins in the blood plasma, are going to stay inside the blood vessels. So they rarely leave the blood vessels. All right. So when we talk about movement of fluid in and out, fluid moving in and out depends on two things. First thing it depends on is blood pressure. Okay, so what the pressure is in the capillary at a particular time. Also depends on the osmotic pressure. So how much osmosis is happening. Now, osmosis, you guys probably remember from grade 8 and grade 10 science, if you took grade 10 science. Osmosis is the movement of water from an area where there's not very much solute to an area where there's lots of solute. So it basically moves to dilute the solute. Okay, so that's the movement that way. All right, so when we take into account blood pressure and osmotic pressure, collectively, those make up what's called the net pressure. So that's the net pressure moving in and out of the capillary. If the net pressure inside the capillary is really big, then we're going to have more movement out. Okay, it's going to put pressure to push outside those little leaks or spaces in the capillary. If we have less net pressure, then it's going to cause movement into the capillary. Okay, so because movement is from an area of low pressure to an area of high pressure. So if there's less pressure, there's going to be movement in. Okay. All right, so blood pressure, what are we talking about? Well, when we talk about blood pressure within a capillary, the pressure is always going to be higher at the end where the arterioles are. And it's going to be lower at the end where the venules are. Why? Who can answer that question? Why? Why is the blood pressure higher at the arterial end and lower at the venous? It's called the venous end, where the veins are. Come on, guys. Why is there no more pressure on the artery side than there is on the venule side? Right, on the artery side, it's closer to where the heart is pumping. And on the venule side, there's less pressure from that pumping action. Absolutely right, okay? So the artery side, right, the heart pumps, moves to the arteries, goes to the arterioles. There's going to be more pressure there. As that blood flows through the capillaries and gets to the venous side, there's less pressure because it's further away from the pumping action of the heart. Good, okay? So it's higher at the arterial end because it's closer to the pumping action of the heart. Okay, the other thing is the osmotic pressure. So pressure due to osmosis. So the movement of fluid into the capillary through osmosis. So why is fluid moving in? It's moving in because there's lots of plasma proteins, and typically those plasma proteins have to stay inside. They can't get out. Okay, so we have this high concentration of plasma proteins. So liquid moves into the capillary to dilute that concentration. So we have this movement into the capillary as a result of that. Now, because the plasma proteins usually stay within the capillary, then we should have the same osmotic pressure on both sides, on the arterial side and the venous side. Now, what can happen sometimes, and you don't need to know this for med services 10, but what can happen is we can end up with these proteins getting out of the capillary. A situation where that can occur is when our body gets histamines, attacked with histamines. So when we have an allergic reaction, histamines actually cause those proteins to be able to get out. So now we have this high concentration of proteins on the outside of the capillary. So then our osmotic pressure moves to the outside, which means fluid starts moving to the outside to balance that out. And that's why we start getting like swelling and inflammation with an allergic reaction, because we get more fluid moving out of the capillary and in between the cells. There's a space in between our cells. It's like something called edema. Okay. So again, you don't have to know that, but it's an example of a situation where those plasma proteins can move. All right, so if we take a look at a summary of what's going on here. Okay, so we have, here we see the blood pressure. Whoops, sorry about that, guys. Let's go back a second here. Put on my draw. Here's our blood pressure, okay? So it's the arterial end. So that means we're gonna have pressure pushing inside the walls of the blood vessel. It's gonna be higher there than it is over here on the venous side, right? So here's the venous side. So that's the side that goes towards the veins. Here's the arterial side. That's the side that came from the arteries, okay? When we look at the osmotic pressure, because those proteins are staying where they are inside the capillary, that osmotic pressure stays the same. But when we look at the difference of it, that's our net pressure. So our net pressure is going out of the arteries on the arterial end and is going, or sorry, out of the capillaries at the arterial end and into the capillaries at the venous end. Okay. All right. So the blood pressure is higher. So material diffuses out of the capillary. So we're going to see our more movement of liquid out of the capillary. So that's where our nutrients and stuff is going to be making its way into the body cells. Okay. At the venous end, blood pressure is lower, so material diffuses into the capillary. So that's our waste product getting into the capillary. Okay. All right. Any questions? So the highlights for this little section here with capillary exchange is capillary exchange is dependent on diffusion, blood pressure, and osmotic pressure. Okay. All right. So next we're going to talk about blood flow. So first of all, blood flows really quickly in arteries. How does that compare to the rate of blood flow in veins? Okay, so just give me a couple words here. How does that rate to the blood flow in veins? Okay, does blood flow faster in veins or slower in veins? Okay, thanks, Aiden and Cora. Blood flows slower in veins. Okay, and the reason why is it's further away from the action of the heart, right? Blood flows very quickly in the arteries because it's close to that pumping action of the heart. The heart pumps, the blood flows fast, right? Veins aren't very close to that, so the blood flows slowly in the veins. Okay, so blood pressure is low in the veins because they're further away from that action of the heart. All right. So what affects blood flow? Well, usually the term we use to describe what affects blood flow is peripheral resistance. So what this means is when blood is going through, so if this is part of a blood vessel, when blood's traveling through, as blood rubs against the walls of that blood vessel, that causes friction, and that friction reduces blood flow. So anything that's going to increase that friction is going to reduce blood flow. So peripheral resistance is all about that friction as the blood's moving along the blood vessel, okay, the walls of the blood vessel. When we talk about peripheral resistance, we're typically referring to small arteries and arterioles. So we're not really looking at veins because veins have such low blood flow to begin with. Okay, so peripheral resistance, how does it get increased? How do we increase that friction? Well, we can increase that through vasoconstriction. So that's something our body does. So remember, vaso means vessel, constriction means to constrict. So when we have vasoconstriction, our blood vessels are constricting. So the diameter of the blood vessel is getting smaller, right? Well, if we have a smaller diameter, then the blood has to really push against the sides, which means there's more peripheral resistance. Okay, so it decreases the flow of the blood. So why does that happen? That happens, we don't have control over that, right? Like you can't decide, I want the blood vessels in my right arm to constrict. We don't have any power over that. So that's part of our autonomic nervous system. And usually our nervous system will do that to respond to a couple of things. So one of the reasons would be stress. So our fight or flight response. So what happens with that is if we have, if we're dealing with fight or flight, so we have this big stress just hits us, like we almost hit a little kid that's walking across the road, okay? Well, what happens is our blood vessels constrict to the parts of our body that don't need blood. So our skin doesn't need a lot of blood during that response, so it constricts, okay? And that helps us deal with stress because now the blood flows, we're going to get more blood flowing to the parts that we need to have it in when we're dealing with stress, like our heart or our muscles. If we have low blood pressure, so there's a lot of different mechanisms in our body to deal with low blood pressure, but one of them is our bodies will cause our blood vessels to constrict to increase the blood pressure, because then that will increase, to increase our blood pressure. Otherwise, we can get faint, etc., if our blood pressure is too low. Okay. All right. Another thing that affects peripheral resistance, and this one causes it to go up, is when our arterioles and our small arteries become less elastic. So remember, our arteries have to be pretty elastic. And here's why, right? Because every time the heart beats, right, here's our artery, it has to expand, right? So they have bulge of blood and then it goes down, and then a bulge of blood and then it goes down, right? And our blood vessels have to be able to handle that bulge, right, to allow the blood flow to continue through. So we want to think about our walls of our arteries kind of like an elastic band, where we can pull the elastic band out and then it comes back in, and we can pull it out and then it comes back in, right? And that's what's going on with our arterioles. If they become less elastic, then the blood vessels aren't able to handle that bulge of blood every time the heart beats, right? So they're not coming out, which means there's going to be more peripheral resistance as the blood's pushing against the sidewalls of the blood vessel, okay? So when does that happen? Usually when you get older. So a lot of things lose elasticity when we get older. For example, the lens in our eye is very elastic. It allows us to focus. We lose that as we get older. Our skin is elastic, right? So when you touch your skin, it bounces right back. You touch your grandparents' skin, it might stay indented for a little while, right? We lose that elasticity. Well, another thing we lose elasticity in is our blood vessels, right? So they don't expand like they're supposed to. The other thing that can cause us to lose elasticity is if we get a buildup of cholesterol. So if we have a really high cholesterol diet for a long period of time, we can get a buildup and it causes our arteries to become a lot harder. And as they get harder, they lose that elasticity, okay? And that also is an example of this, reduced elasticity, increasing peripheral resistance. Okay. It's also increased by the viscosity of blood, so how thick the blood is. So this word viscosity, you should know this word, but it's one that you learned in grade 8 science, right? So it's how thick a liquid is. So if we have really, really thick blood, it's going to drag along the walls of the blood vessel, okay, which is going to increase the peripheral resistance, okay? So it decreases the flow of the blood. As a result, so why does this happen? This can happen if we're dehydrated, so we don't have enough liquid in our blood. Okay, remember water is the main component of blood plasma, so there's less water in it. Or if we have a condition called polycythemia. So what this means is that we have way too many red blood cells, so our blood is just way too thick with red blood cells. Okay, all right, so there's one more thing we need to know with peripheral resistance, and it's decreased by, right? We have less resistance if we have less blood volume. And that makes sense. If we don't have as much blood, there's less push against the wall of the blood vessel. So this would occur as a result of hemorrhage. So if we're losing blood, then we're going to have less resistance. Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. All right. So blood pressure. So when we talk about blood pressure is equal to cardiac output. So it's affected here by cardiac output. Whoops. Let's go back there. Let's put on my pen. Cardiac output and peripheral resistance. Okay. That's our blood pressure. That's what affects it. So when we think about cardiac output, remember cardiac output is affected by stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate. Okay, so who can remind me what stroke volume means? What does it mean when we use the term stroke volume? If you're having a hard time typing, you can just unmute and tell me out loud. Stroke volume. All right, so stroke volume is the volume of blood, thank you, that leaves our heart with every beat. Exactly right. The volume of blood. So every time our heart beats, that's how much blood's coming out of our heart. That's our stroke volume. Okay. All right. Our heart rate is how many times our heart beats every minute. So if we multiply those two together, we get our cardiac output. Okay. When we look at this, right, our peripheral resistance, so we've talked about blood vessel diameter, right? So if our diameter of our blood vessel gets smaller, we're going to have more resistance. Elasticity. If our blood vessel loses elasticity, we're going to have more resistance because it can't bulge. Blood viscosity. If our blood gets too thick, we're going to have more resistance, right? As it's rubbing against the sides of the blood vessel. Total blood volume. If we have a lot more blood volume, usually we don't have a situation with more, usually it's less. So if we have less blood volume, then we're going to have less peripheral resistance. Okay. So if we have a high cardiac output and lots of peripheral resistance, our blood pressure is going to go up. If we have a low cardiac output with a low peripheral resistance, our blood pressure is going to go down. Okay. All right. Any questions? Okay. All right. So I just wanted to talk, spend a couple minutes talking about what we mean when we say blood pressure, right? So blood pressure is the pressure that the blood's pushing on the inside wall of the blood vessel, right? So that's what we see with this image is the pressure that's being pushed on that wall. Just think about a hose, right? So if we run water through a hose, if the water is just trickling through the hose, we're not going to have a lot of pressure pushing against the walls of the hose. But if we're forcing a lot of water in, that hose gets really, really tight. Like the whole hose is hard because there's lots of pressure pushing against the sides of that insides of that hose. Okay. All right, blood pressure in our blood vessels can decrease depending on how far away they are from the heart. Okay, so if we look over here, our aorta, that's really close to the heart. There's going to be lots of pressure. The vena cavae, right? That's the inferior and superior vena cava. They're going to be really low pressure because they're really far away from the heart. Okay, another review question. What ventricle, or sorry, I just gave you a hint. What chamber forces the blood into the aorta? What chamber forces the blood into the aorta? Yeah, the left ventricle. Okay, so that's something for us to remember. The left ventricle forces the blood into the aorta. Okay. All right. If we look at the next slide here, we can see 4 different regions of where the blood is flowing in our body, right? So we see the highest pressure is here in the aorta, right? And that makes sense. That left ventricle is more muscular. We can see all this muscle here. So it's going to pump that blood the hardest. The next the next artery has the next highest pressure, right? And that would be our pulmonary arteries. That's coming from the right ventricle. Still directly from the heart, but the right ventricle doesn't have as much muscle. Low pressure would be here with the pulmonary vein because it's still not that far away from the heart. That blood hasn't traveled all throughout the body yet, right? It still has a little bit of steam left from being pushed by the heart. And then our very lowest pressure would be in the vena cava because that blood is the furthest away from the heart. Okay? All right, and I think that was where I wanted to end. Yeah, sure is. Okay, so again, you guys had a worksheet due today and a worksheet due Wednesday. People with outstanding stuff, I will send you an email just to remind you. If you missed the heart quiz, send me an email and I will open up a heart quiz for you to write, but you have to let me know. Don't forget you have a quiz that I'm going to open up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It'll close noon on Wednesday, and that quiz is for blood vessels and blood. And I think that was all I needed to say. Was there any questions? All right. So I'm going to stop there then. And you guys have yourselves a wonderful weekend. And we will see you here on Monday. Remember, your quiz is not on this stuff, okay? It is not on this booklet at all. So nothing on this booklet will be on your quiz. Okay. See you Monday.